I am the program manager of our SharePoint RecordPoint program at the Department of Education, as well as Alon said, having a very small information management consultancy as well. But I was brought into the Department of Education it's about 2 years ago now, a little over, to help manage their migration from a legacy document records management system, eDocs. Some of you might be familiar with it. That product had sort of become end of life, and they were working through the process of whether or not to move to a new version or to have a look at other products. So the department did a market scan of other products that were out there. And while they were sort of going through that scan, our Director of Information and Knowledge Management sort of made he identified that we already had a secondary document records management system at the department in SharePoint. The previous EDRMS eDocs was not going to be too unkind to the technology, because it does what it does very, very well. It's actually quite a good enterprise content management system. It just hadn't been adopted very well. The training had been poor. It had been set up to reflect our RDA, so it was a very records view of the world. But we also had SharePoint on the side, which we were seeing was very well used. It was our intranet. There were a number of team sites and collaboration sites that had already been set up. So we made the enterprise architectural decision to, instead of bring in another product into the department, to extend our use of SharePoint to manage records, so which brought us to RecordPoint. And as we started identifying, or sort of looking under the covers with RecordPoint, there was a number of sort of secondary benefits that we identified beyond sort of putting in a new system. It was going to be much faster for us to implement. It was going to be significantly cheaper. It was going to help us simplify our IT stack. We were going to be able to drive adoption much better, because it was a system that people already knew in some respects, or were aware of in others, because they were having to deal with it day to day. So for a project that started predominantly on lifting compliance in the organisation, because we had a very low level of compliance with our electronic records, there were some other benefits that sort of became apparent as we went through the business case and justification process.
So, thanks, Rory, for the
long
overview
introduction
there. Yes. So this was more than a records initiative, as you were saying, in terms of those goals. I mean, how did you? I'm interested in how that the way you presented it changed over time back into the business. I mean, did it start as a records initiative and morph from there, or was it something that you always started off with a view that this was a broader initiative?
Yeah, so it initially started off as a compliance activity, trying to improve the level of compliance around our electronic documents and records. But in parallel to that, the move away from eDocs, we developed an information strategy. And a key component of that information strategy was to improve collaboration and knowledge sharing within the department, and SharePoint was seen as a key component of that. So what did start out as an activity to sort of improve compliance, once we started heading down the SharePoint path, we discovered that we could realise a lot of other collaborative and business process benefits along the way by using SharePoint.
So, I mean, I'd like to drill down on the main pain points that you were trying to address as part of the initiative. I mean, you've talked about the goals. Looking at it more from a negative point of view, what were those pain points in terms of how you'd previously managed documents and records? You talked about usability and user adoption. Can you drill into that a bit further, and why that was an issue?
So the issue was mostly around product familiarisation, training, and adoption. People weren't really all that au fait with eDocs. What we were discovering is that people were managing their documents and business processes in SharePoint, and only at such time that they considered that document to be final or a record would they then put it into eDocs. So we thought, well, why don't we just cut out that final step and just keep everything where it is and manage it in place.
And one of the big things that we've talked about is training and change management. I think that's often, as we previously talked about, where projects can fail. But equally, trying to minimise the impact on the business to minimise that training, or keep it to the bare essentials. How did you guys tackle that? And was there a strong tradition of good training and change management in the department before?
So to the last point, no, there wasn't a great one. There'd been some attempts, and we did have support for our eDocs platform, but in terms of how we positioned this and how we rolled it out to users, we very rarely talked about records. In fact, we mostly talked about getting the value out of SharePoint, improving business process, bringing information into one area, the improvements that we would get out of search. I mean, we did have to touch on the records component because we obviously had to draw that correlation between SharePoint and RecordPoint, but for the majority of users, what we were really focused on was a SharePoint adoption activity rather than a records activity.
So that's sort of how you made the users care. I talked about in my presentation the fundamental problem with records management is most end users don't really care. How did you deal with that care factor?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I kind of move away from the idea that they don't care. Most people want to be a good corporate citizen. They want to do the right thing. They want to make sure that they're managing their documents and as records in a way that is sort of agreeable to the organisation. But they really want you to make it easy for them. They don't want to have to learn a business process. They don't want to have to learn something new. They want good records management to be a subset of good information management and business process, so that it becomes an outcome of doing what they do day to day rather than a business process in of itself.
So I've talked about the users, the other obviously important stakeholder group, and we have some of them here today, are the records team. So in your view, and I'd be interested in the feedback from the guys as well, if you've got any further comments on this, is what do you see being in it for the records team as you roll out?
So the records guys come along today to have a little bit more of a look at RecordPoint, because we're in our transition phase at the moment. So my project's finishing up and we are transitioning into operations. So they probably haven't started managing records in anger yet. But in the long term, what it's going to give them is the ability to centrally manage their records policy and apply that, I guess, in multiple locations. So rather than asking people to bring their documents to a system, we're just asking them to work where they want to work, and we'll literally go and find them. So I guess we had very low levels of records compliance in an electronic form previously. There's going to be a significant amount of significantly more content for them to manage sort of going forward. We spent a significant portion of our budget on change management and adoption. So I had a team of, at one point, up to 14 people, including trainers and sort of business consultants and technical people, working with, and they were also doing some portions of the intranet, so maybe I'll eliminate 3 or 4 people there. But we had quite a number of people working with the business to understand what their processes are, how they work, how they communicate, the types of terminology they use, so that we could create environments for them that did make sense. I mean, SharePoint is intuitive, there's no doubt about it, but you do need to put a little bit of time and effort into making sure that you establish those collaborative environments appropriately so that they remain intuitive and that they can scale out.
If I can add to what Rory said there, I think the issue with metadata and profiling of documents, and I've been involved in projects in the past on the customer side where you've gone, great, I can ask people for all this metadata. The first step is to avoid going down that path. It's really, I suppose my view of metadata is if you have to ask yourself, well, what's in it for the user to answer this? What are they going to get back? What value is it? And actually, do they understand what it is you're asking? Because if they don't understand what you're asking, you'll either end up with garbage or you'll end up with nothing. We had a customer in the UK actually, and it was quite a funny story, where he had basically, I suppose, a set of tags, which was a mandatory field, which was a drop down in SharePoint where he was profiling documents. And he hadn't really done that analysis around, what do users care about. So the first thing in the list was asbestos, because it was a OC health and safety thing, but they hadn't really trained it, and he hadn't really explained the value in it back to the user. So he had a call from the customer a little while later going, hey, I've got this big asbestos problem. And what had turned out was everyone was just clicking OK, and suddenly all these documents were tagged with asbestos. I said it would have been more fun if he'd had aardvark in the list. He could have had an aardvark problem. But I suppose that's the issue with metadata profiling. Our view is try and grab as much as you can from the implicit metadata that's available, because you know who they are, what department they're from, those sorts of things, and then just be really sparing with the extra metadata you ask for.
I think that, sorry, to sort of round out my answer, we didn't go really, really deep and try and create these ginormous metadata taxonomies. We did keep it fairly light and use the implicit metadata as much as possible.
If I can deal with that one. I suppose the advantage of RecordPoint, because it is a rules engine, you can just ask them for metadata that's relevant to them, that helps them, and then from that you can extract out enough to actually apply the records classification that you need. So absolutely, I mean, to answer your question, yes, you do, but you try and obscure the specific record stuff as much as you possibly can. Yeah.
Yes, Rory, I'm interested from the point of view.
The question is, what level of access is expected around these systems? Is it sort of, I suppose, core ministry and administrative workers, or is it also teachers and people out in the schools?
So, as a secondary school teacher, the really nitty-gritty details I'm happy to get into with you afterwards. But by and large, our system is open. That is our default position, and that would include teachers who have an Edgemail ID and a login. They would be able to access this information, save for anything that we might consider to be of protected level. So anything that might be a cabinet document or anything that has a dissemination limiting marker on it. So HR, protected disclosures, those types of information. But anything that I can access as a general sort of user within the department, we would suggest that is open to teachers as well, because they are, I mean, we all report to the same boss, they report to the secretary, I report to the secretary. So there's a bit of a shift in focus. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine what that's like from the way the department sort of treated schools in the past, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to address that in the future later on. But in terms of if a teacher wanted access to certainly my project site today, they would be able to find it. So we are about to put in a new, what's called our briefings and correspondence workflow, which will manage all of our departmental briefings and correspondence up to and including the secretary, but will get inked in a minister's office, and that will be open again by default, save for anything that is considered sensitive. So only the people that would be involved in the approval of that briefing would be able to see a sensitive briefing, but other than that, we would be opening that up by default. We have a very progressive Director of Information Management at the department. What's interesting is that he also owns the process for freedom of information, so he sees the types of releases that we get asked for all the time. So his view is, why do I spend so much time securing information that if someone were to ask for it out in the public, I have to give it to them anyway?
Cool. So one of the themes that I dealt with in there was migration, and I suppose putting forward a different approach to migration. How did you guys tackle the migration question, Rory?
We have yet to migrate from eDocs, but we currently are in the process of planning that out. We are literally, because it was relatively unloved, as I said, it was more used as a sort of finalisation archive rather than, I guess, a proper enterprise content management system. We don't really see a need for us to say, identify all the legal documents and put them into an active legal site, or identify all of the information knowledge management documents and put them in an information knowledge management site. We're literally picking it up and putting it into an archive and wrapping search around it. Majority of users would search for documents within our legacy system by DocID, so we'll expose that through search and people will be able to find it.
So you have stepped back and gone, well, why are we doing this? What's the business objective?
That's right.
Rather than just going, we must migrate, and we must migrate in a traditional way.
Yeah, no, we're trying to do this as painlessly as possible. I've been burnt by a number of migrations in the past, so I want to do this quite simply.
Yeah, no worries. And I suppose just to sum up, and you've talked a little bit about this, where are you guys at now, and what are the next steps that you see?
So literally, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we made our legacy EDRMS read-only as we've transitioned people onto SharePoint. That was relatively painless. I did expect a lot more noise than we got, but it's been great thus far. We'll be migrating the data out of eDocs in December. So that's to sort of round out the first sort of tranche of work that we're looking to do. We're currently in the process of developing a business case to augment our use of RecordPoint out into schools. I think there's an interesting slide out there, and more what Miles was talking to, that people are creating content all over the place. Schools have been relatively independent entities for some time now, and they have had the option to spin up Office 365 tenants, and they have been doing it in their droves. They've been connecting to the department's own Office 365 tenant, but they've also been creating their own. We have a departmental Twitter account, we have a departmental Facebook account. We're seeing schools spin up their own Yammer instances to communicate with teachers and parents to connect them all up to talk about what's going on at school. So the amount of content that's being created that genuinely, there is a genuine use case for us to records manage is expanding. There was talk that one of our former senior executives was sharing information with another department quite legitimately, but using Dropbox because our own enterprise tools didn't allow for it. So we're having to catch up very quickly from a records perspective now that we've gone down this SharePoint RecordPoint path. There is a lot of other work we're going to have to do to, I guess, not ask people to bring records to us, but provide the facility for us to actually go out and find them, generate rules that will go out and sort of, not seek and destroy, but seek and sentence, and manage that policy centrally.
Thanks. And I suppose I'm interested just to talk about the cloud, and obviously with the Office 365 story. How has that changed over the last few years that you've worked at education in terms of, I suppose, embracing the cloud or seeing it as a legitimate option?
Yeah, I think certainly when I started at at the department 2 years ago, cloud was a dirty word. It was considered a great future technology, but not something the department wanted to consider at that time. But even in that short 24 months, we've seen somewhere in the vicinity of 180 schools take up our Office 365 tenanted offering. So, you know, the policy had to change, I guess the privacy nervousness had to change, and that all happened within the space of about 12 months. So now we're starting to see a greater appetite for the cloud. The economics of it are incredibly compelling, particularly for a government department. There is still that delta between what our cloud first government strategy says and what our own department's acceptable level of risk are, but the barriers to that are very, very quickly being removed. So data sovereignty was a huge one, privacy was a big one. As I mentioned earlier, we have an information strategy that we're developing in parallel with this initiative that has a whole bunch of activities that it needs to undertake, but one of them was to develop an information security classification policy. That's now been done. The second is to develop a information security controls framework that's currently in train. So all of these potential sort of privacy and security barriers that we've almost imposed on ourselves that have stopped us moving to the cloud are very, very quickly being removed, and I think we'll see quite an aggressive push towards the cloud, particularly for schools over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. Yeah,
I think just to extend on that, the pace of change that you've witnessed in the department, we've also witnessed, I suppose, from talking to other customers. So our two early adopters of our Records 365 product, which is a pure SaaS offering in the cloud managing Office 365, are both federal government agencies. And if you'd said that to me a year ago, I would have said you're mad. There's no way that adoption is going to occur first in a government space. It'll be something that commercial organisations will adopt.
Our main focus was to target those users who were heavy eDocs users. We had to, establish an environment for them to store their documents or records. They've been the good corporate citizens. We looked after them. In parallel, we also looked at divisions that had heavy share drive usage or even heavy SharePoint usage, and tried to either bring them into our new SharePoint setup that had the connectors into RecordPoint. Or we will deal with some of the information that has been on existing SharePoint sites. We'll be imposing RecordPoint rules on those sites. So we have actually created a site for every division and branch within the department. Our focus over the next sort of 3 or 4 months is to continue to drive adoption. We've trained somewhere in the vicinity of about 1,480 people in SharePoint, so we've seen a really aggressive uptake of our offering, and we don't expect that to slow down. So.
What was that training? What did that consist of?
We had, so the 1,480 people has been through the classroom.
Yeah.
Not that I necessarily suggest that is the only way to go, because we've also developed web-based learning modules, our quick reference guides. We've got our learning hub and everything for that for people to use. But we have had a relatively low level of technical competency within the department. relative to other organisations that I've worked in. And there's a lot of people who have worked in education prior to joining the department, so there was quite an appetite for classroom-based training.
What's on the horizon for other content? I mean, I showed the Rubik's Cube graphic earlier. What's on your Rubik's Cube?
So in the short term, anyone who's working in Office 365, so our schools that have taken up that Office 365 offering on the Department of Education tenant, we'd also like to address the schools that are using their own Office 365 tenants. We have approximately 13.5 terabytes of data in share drives that are genuinely being used for business purposes. Some people just won't let go of them. We need to do an activity to identify what it is we actually need to keep out of those file shares and what we need to records manage in there. It's sort of been on the agenda for a while, but everyone sort of just doesn't want to deal with it because it seems too hard, because it's always been perceived that we would have to do a migration of that content into SharePoint so that it could be records managed. So we're talking to you guys about the File Connect piece and being able to run rules across those file shares to extract the critical records that we need to manage, so that we've actually got a handle on them.
And I suppose finally, I'd like your personal views on that hybrid model that I talked about. I mean, that seems pretty much what you guys are adopting at the department. I mean, do you see that as something that's applicable or makes sense for most, particularly government organisations? Well,
I think the thing is we're already doing it.
Yeah.
We have departmental staff using Office 365. We have departmental staff using SharePoint on premise.
So it's just the way it is.
It's just the way it is, but we need to continually I guess keep across the developments out in the cloud, because I think that we're only going to see more and more content out there over time. So yeah, it's interesting that the types and the types of content and the environments that it lives in that we're going to have to manage as a department is only going to grow. I think this is only the starting point of our journey.
Please would you thank Rory for coming along, being with us here today. Thank you.